The billionaire's son threw knives at every nanny until the maid caught one and threw it back. In the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, behind the towering glass walls of the prestigious Meridian Tower, whispers echoed through marble corridors about the Harrison penthouse. It was a place where screaming had replaced conversation, where the sound of shattering glass punctuated each morning like a violent symphony. Just 4 years ago, this same home had been featured on the cover of Architectural Digest as a masterpiece of modern luxury and warmth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Harrison had been the kind of mother who turned everyday moments into adventures. A former pediatric surgeon with gentle hands and an infectious laugh, she would transform their sprawling penthouse into kingdoms and castles, where 8-year-old Marcus could be anything he dreamed. The pristine white walls bore colorful crayon masterpieces that she refused to wash off, claiming they were better than any gallery exhibit. She would chase him through the endless hallways, both of them sliding across the polished marble floors in their socks, filling the 30,000-square-foot space with pure joy. But when a drunk driver stole Victoria's life on a rainy Tuesday evening 3 years ago, the laughter died with her. The penthouse, once alive with warmth, transformed into a cold mausoleum where every footstep echoed like a funeral march. Marcus, now 11, had become something his mother would never recognize. The sweet boy who once built blanket forts and painted pictures of rainbows had evolved into a force of destruction that terrorized anyone who dared enter his domain. Richard Harrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor of Harrison Industries, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a conquered territory. At 51, he commanded a financial empire worth $12 billion. Yet he felt powerless against the chaos that had consumed his home. His steel-gray hair, always perfectly styled for board meetings and television interviews, showed the strain of sleepless nights. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders carried a weight that no amount of money could lift. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his brooding thoughts. His assistant's voice carried a familiar tone of defeat. "Mr. Harrison, I'm afraid Mrs. Whitmore has just resigned. She says she won't return under any circumstances." Richard closed his eyes, feeling another piece of his composure crumble. Mrs. Whitmore had been nanny number 17. Like the 16 before her, she had lasted exactly 3 days. The pattern was always the same. The nannies would arrive with impressive credentials, glowing recommendations, and unshakable confidence in their ability to handle difficult children. They would meet Marcus during the interview process when he was on his best behavior, charming and polite, speaking in the refined manner that his mother had taught him. But once they were alone with him, the real Marcus emerged. It started small. Hidden thumbtacks on chairs, salt in the sugar bowl, alarm clocks set to ring at 3 in the morning. When subtle sabotage failed to drive them away, Marcus escalated. He would lock nannies in closets, release pet snakes in their bedrooms, or trigger the building's fire alarm during their afternoon naps. But his signature move, the one that sent every caregiver fleeing, was the knives. Marcus had discovered his father's collection of antique throwing knives during one of his many unsupervised explorations of the penthouse. The set, worth more than most people's annual salaries, had been a gift from a business partner in Tokyo. Richard had never imagined his son would turn them into weapons of psychological warfare. Marcus had practiced for months, transforming himself into a frighteningly accurate marksman. He'd never aimed to hurt anyone, but the nannies didn't know that. When a blade whistled past their ear and embedded itself in the wall inches from their head, they saw only a dangerous child who needed more help than they could provide. The morning after Mrs. Whitmore's departure, Richard sat in his home office, a room that had once been Victoria's reading nook. She used to curl up in the window seat with medical journals, occasionally looking up to blow him kisses when she caught him staring. Now the space felt sterile and unwelcoming, filled only with the weight of his failures as a father. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his dark hair tousled from sleep, wearing pajamas that hung loose on his thin frame. He had inherited his mother's striking green eyes, but where hers had sparkled with life and compassion, his held a coldness that chilled Richard to the bone. The boy, who had once run to him for bedtime stories, now regarded him with the distant politeness of a stranger. "I heard Mrs. Whitmore screaming last night," Marcus said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I assume she won't be joining us for breakfast." Richard studied his son's face, searching for any hint of remorse or shame. He found nothing but calculated indifference. "Marcus, we've talked about this. These women are trying to help you. Your behavior is unacceptable." "I don't need help," Marcus replied, his tone sharp despite his young age. "I don't need anyone." The boy turned and walked away, leaving Richard alone with his growing desperation. How had his brilliant, beautiful child become this cold stranger? How had he failed so completely that his own son preferred isolation to human connection? The truth was that Richard had retreated into his work after Victoria's death, burying his grief beneath mergers and acquisitions, board meetings and business trips. He told himself that providing for Marcus financially was enough, that hiring the best caregivers money could buy was adequate parenting. But deep down, he knew he was running from the pain of loss just as desperately as his son was lashing out from it. Richard's mother, Eleanor Harrison, lived in the penthouse's guest wing, a woman of 75 who had once been the reigning queen of Manhattan society. Even now, confined to a wheelchair after a stroke 2 years prior, she maintained the imperious bearing that had made her legendary in social circles. Her silver hair was always perfectly coiffured, her makeup flawless, despite rarely leaving the apartment. She ruled her small domain with the same iron will that had helped her husband build the Harrison fortune decades ago. Eleanor had very specific ideas about how Marcus should be handled. In her view, the boy needed discipline, structure, and absolutely no mention of his deceased mother. She believed that dwelling on the past was weakness, that successful people moved forward without looking back. Every family portrait that included Victoria had been removed from the main living areas at her insistence. Marcus's art projects and school photos had been relegated to his bedroom, hidden away like shameful secrets. "The boy needs military school," Eleanor announced during one of their weekly dinners, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "All this coddling and therapy nonsense is making him weak. What he needs is discipline and routine." Richard pushed his food around his plate, no longer hungry. "Mother, he's 11 years old. He's not a recruit who needs to be broken down and rebuilt." "He's a Harrison," Eleanor replied sharply. "And Harrisons don't throw tantrums or terrorize the help. Your father would roll over in his grave if he saw how you're handling this situation." The dining room fell silent, except for the soft clink of silverware against china. Marcus sat between them, methodically cutting his steak into precise squares, seemingly oblivious to the conversation about his future. But Richard noticed the slight tightening around his son's eyes, the barely perceptible tension in his small shoulders. Eleanor's approach had failed as spectacularly as everything else they had tried. The harder she pushed for discipline and emotional suppression, the more volatile Marcus became. It was as if he could sense that his grandmother was trying to erase his mother's memory, and he fought back the only way he knew how. The cycle continued for months. Nannies arrived with hope and departed with trauma. Child psychologists offered theories and strategies that crumbled under the weight of Marcus's intelligence and determination. Private tutors lasted longer than nannies, but rarely more than a month. The boy was brilliant, absorbing information with frightening speed, but he used his intelligence as a weapon rather than a tool for growth. Doctor, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia Vaughan, the latest in a long line of child therapists, sat across from Richard in his office, her expression grave. She was a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a reputation for working miracles with troubled children. But even she seemed defeated by the challenge Marcus presented. "Mr. Harrison, I need to be direct with you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Marcus is one of the most intelligent children I've ever worked with, but he's also deeply traumatized. He's not acting out for attention or because he's inherently cruel. He's trying to maintain control in a world where he felt utterly powerless when he lost his mother." Richard nodded, though he had heard similar explanations from countless professionals. "So what do we do? How do we reach him?" Dr. Vaughan leaned forward, her expression compassionate. "He needs someone who won't be intimidated by his behavior, someone who can see past the anger to the frightened child underneath. But more importantly, he needs to feel safe enough to grieve. Right now, he's so focused on pushing people away that he hasn't had the chance to process his loss." "We've tried grief counseling," Richard said wearily. "He refuses to participate. He won't talk about Victoria at all. That's because talking about her makes the loss real," Dr. Vaughan explained. "As long as he doesn't acknowledge that she's gone, he can maintain the fantasy that she might come back. It's a common response in children who've experienced sudden loss." Richard left the meeting feeling more hopeless than ever. If trained professionals couldn't help his son, what chance did he have? He was a businessman, skilled at negotiations and strategic planning, but completely at a loss when it came to understanding the mind of his traumatized child. The following Monday brought another new face to the Harrison household. Mrs. Kellaway was a stern British woman with 30 years of experience managing difficult children. She carried herself with military precision, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, her clothes crisp and professional. She had come highly recommended by a British diplomat whose own troubled son had apparently been transformed under her care. "I don't believe in coddling," she announced during her interview. "Children need boundaries, consequences, and consistent discipline. Master Marcus will learn to respect authority, or he'll learn what happens when he doesn't." Richard found her confidence refreshing after months of failure. Perhaps what Marcus needed was someone who wouldn't be swayed by his manipulation or intimidated by his threats. Mrs. Kellaway lasted exactly 48 hours. On Wednesday morning, Richard's driver found her sitting on the building's front steps, her suitcase beside her, staring blankly at the morning traffic. She had aged years in 2 days, her military bearing replaced by shell-shock defeat. "What happened?" Richard asked, though he dreaded the answer. Mrs. Kellaway looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Your son isn't just difficult, Mr. Harrison. He's calculating. He studied me, learned my routines, my fears, my weaknesses. Then he systematically dismantled my sanity." She shuddered, pulling her coat tighter despite the warm spring morning. "The knives were nothing compared to what he did to my room. He somehow discovered that I'm claustrophobic, and he turned my bedroom into a maze of furniture and hanging sheets. When I woke up in the middle of the night, I couldn't find my way out. I spent 3 hours trapped in there, calling for help that never came." Richard's stomach clenched with a mixture of horror and shame. "Mrs. Kellaway, I'm so sorry. They had no idea he was capable of such psychological manipulation." "He's not evil," she said quietly, standing to collect her suitcase. "But he's the most frightened child I've ever encountered. And frightened children with his intelligence and resources are dangerous. He needs help that I'm not qualified to provide." As Richard watched her taxi disappear into the morning traffic, he felt the last of his hope drain away. If Mrs. Kellaway, with her decades of experience and military discipline, couldn't handle Marcus, who could? His son had become a master manipulator at 11 years old, using his pain as a weapon against anyone who tried to help him. That afternoon, Eleanor summoned him to her sitting room, a space she had decorated in shades of cream and gold that spoke to her expensive tastes. She sat in her wheelchair by the window, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the sheer curtains. Despite her physical limitations, she still commanded attention and respect through sheer force of personality. "This has gone on long enough," she announced without preamble. "The boy is becoming a public embarrassment. Do you know that Mrs. Patterson from the building's board mentioned his behavior at yesterday's meeting? She's received complaints from other residents about the screaming and disruptions." Richard slumped into a chair across from her, feeling every one of his 51 years. "What do you suggest, Mother? We've tried everything. Nannies, therapists, tutors, even a behavioral specialist from Johns Hopkins. Nothing works." "Send him away," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "There are excellent boarding schools that specialize in troubled children. Military academies that will teach him discipline and respect. He can receive the structure he needs while we maintain our privacy and dignity." The suggestion hit Richard like a physical blow. "He's my son, Mother. He's all I have left of Victoria. I can't just send him away because he's inconvenient." Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. "Richard, you're not helping him by keeping him here. Look at what he's become. Victoria wouldn't recognize the child he's turned into. Sometimes love means making difficult decisions." Richard knew there was logic in her words, but the thought of sending Marcus away felt like another betrayal. He had already failed as a father by retreating into work after Victoria's death. How could he compound that failure by abandoning his son entirely? That evening, he found Marcus in the penthouse's library, a room that had been Victoria's pride and joy. She had filled the floor-to-ceiling shelves with everything from classic literature to medical textbooks, creating cozy reading nooks throughout the space. Marcus sat in what had been his mother's favorite chair, reading a book on military strategy that was far too advanced for his age. "We need to talk," Richard said, settling into the chair across from him. Marcus looked up with those unsettling green eyes, his expression guarded but attentive. "About what?" "About your behavior. About the nannies. About what happens next." Marcus closed the book carefully, marking his place with a leather bookmark that had been a gift from Victoria. "Are you sending me away?" The question was asked with such matter-of-fact calmness that Richard felt his heart break a little more. How had his son become so resigned to abandonment? "I don't want to," Richard said honestly. "But I don't know how to help you anymore. I don't know how to reach you." For a moment, just a moment, Richard thought he saw a flicker of vulnerability in Marcus's eyes. But it disappeared so quickly he might have imagined it. "You can't reach me because you're not trying," Marcus said quietly. "You hire strangers to take care of me, while you hide in your office or travel for business. You want someone else to fix me, so you don't have to deal with the inconvenience." The words stung because they held more truth than Richard wanted to acknowledge. He had been avoiding his son, using work as an excuse to escape the painful reminder of what they had both lost. But hearing it from Marcus, stated so directly and without emotion, forced him to confront his failures as a father. "You're right," Richard admitted, the words coming out hoarse and broken. "I've been running away, but I don't know how to be what you need. I don't know how to help you heal when I'm still broken myself." Marcus studied him for a long moment, and Richard caught a glimpse of the intelligent, perceptive child his son had become. Despite his young age, Marcus understood grief and abandonment in ways no child should have to. "I don't want to be fixed," Marcus said finally. "I want to be left alone." "That's not an option," Richard replied gently. "You're 11 years old. You need guidance, supervision, someone who cares about your well-being." "Then stop hiring strangers," Marcus shot back, his mask of indifference slipping slightly. "Stop bringing people into our home who don't know Mom, who don't understand what we lost, who think they can replace what's missing with rules and schedules and fake smiles." Richard sat in stunned silence, realizing that his son had been more aware of the family's dynamics than any of them had given him credit for. Marcus wasn't just lashing out at authority figures or testing boundaries. He was protecting his mother's memory from people who saw her loss as nothing more than a problem to be solved. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Richard was reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant announced that someone named Elena Rodriguez was there about the housekeeping position. He frowned, having no memory of posting such a position, but his current housekeeper had quit the previous week after finding snakeskins in the laundry room. Elena Rodriguez was not what Richard had expected. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with warm brown eyes and an air of quiet confidence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore plain but clean clothing that suggested practicality over fashion. There was something in her manner that immediately set her apart from the parade of nannies and caregivers who had preceded her. "Mr. Harrison, thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of immigrant roots. "I heard through a friend that you might need someone to help maintain your home." Richard gestured for her to sit, though he wasn't sure why he was bothering with an interview when he hadn't even advertised the position. "What kind of experience do you have, Miss Rodriguez?" "Mrs. Rodriguez," she corrected gently. "I'm a widow. I've been cleaning homes for 8 years, since my husband passed. I also have experience with children." Something in the way she mentioned her widowhood caught Richard's attention. There was pain there, carefully controlled but undeniably present. It was a grief he recognized because it mirrored his own. "Do you have references?" he asked, though he found himself more interested in her story than her qualifications. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of recommendation letters. As Richard scanned them, he was impressed by the consistent themes that emerged. Honest, reliable, trustworthy. But what struck him most were the personal notes several employers had added about her kindness and understanding during difficult times. "Mrs. Chen mentions that you helped her family through a difficult period," Richard noted, looking up from the letters. "She says you were more than just an employee." Elena's expression softened. "Mrs. Chen's mother-in-law had dementia. She was scared and confused, and the family was struggling to cope. I spent extra time with her, learned a few words in Mandarin to help her feel more comfortable. It wasn't part of my job, but it was the right thing to do." Richard found himself leaning forward, intrigued by this woman who seemed to understand that caring for people meant more than just completing assigned tasks. "And the Johnsons write that you helped their teenage son through a difficult time at school." "Tommy was being bullied," Elena explained simply. "He was a good kid who just needed someone to listen without judgment. Sometimes that's all any of us need." As they talked, Richard realized that Elena wasn't just applying for a job. She was offering something that had been missing from their home for 3 years: genuine human compassion. The nannies and caregivers had been skilled professionals, but they had approached Marcus as a problem to be solved rather than a child to be understood. "I should warn you," Richard said carefully, "this isn't an ordinary household. My son has had some behavioral issues since his mother passed away. We've had difficulty finding staff who can handle the challenges he presents." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "How old is your son?" 11. "And he's very intelligent, very determined, and very angry about his loss." "Anger is often easier than sadness," Elena observed quietly, "especially for children who feel like they have to be strong." There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with grief and its many disguises. Richard found himself wanting to know more about this woman who spoke about loss with such understanding. "The position would involve general housekeeping duties," Richard continued, "but you would inevitably have contact with Marcus. I want to be completely honest with you about what that might entail. He has driven away 17 nannies in the past year. He can be manipulative, destructive, and occasionally dangerous." Elena absorbed this information without flinching. "What kind of dangerous?" "He throws knives," Richard admitted, feeling foolish as he said it. "Antique throwing knives. He never aims to hurt anyone, but he uses them to intimidate and frighten caregivers." And most people would have ended the interview at that point. Instead, Elena asked, "Does he throw them when he's angry or when he's scared?" The question surprised Richard with its insight. "I'm not sure I understand the distinction." Children lash out differently, depending on what they're feeling," Elena explained. "Anger is hot and immediate. Fear is calculated and defensive. Understanding the difference can help you respond appropriately." Richard realized that in all the months of therapy sessions and behavioral assessments, no one had asked such a simple yet profound question. They had focused on Marcus's actions without trying to understand the emotions driving them. "I think," Richard said slowly, "that he throws them when he's scared. When he feels like someone is trying to get too close or change too much too quickly." Elena nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Children who have lost a parent often feel like they need to protect what's left of their family, even if it means protecting it from help. The interview continued for another hour, during which Richard found himself sharing more about his family's situation than he had intended. There was something about Elena's calm presence that encouraged honesty. She didn't judge or offer easy solutions. She simply listened with the kind of attention that made him feel heard for the first time in months. When they finished talking, Richard realized he had already made his decision. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just qualified for the job. She was exactly what their broken family needed, someone who understood loss, who didn't shy away from difficult emotions, who saw past problematic behaviors to the pain underneath. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said as she gathered her references, "would you be willing to start tomorrow?" Elena smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, Richard felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Elena Rodriguez arrived at the Harrison penthouse at precisely 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, carrying a worn leather bag and wearing the same practical clothing from her interview. The doorman, James, had been briefed about her arrival and escorted her to the private elevator that served only the penthouse floor. As the elevator climbed silently toward the 50th floor, Elena took deep breaths, preparing herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. The penthouse doors opened directly into a grand foyer that took Elena's breath away. Polished marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the morning light that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the vaulted ceiling, and priceless artwork adorned the walls. But despite its obvious luxury, the space felt cold and unwelcoming, like a museum where people happened to live rather than a home filled with warmth and love. Richard Harrison emerged from what appeared to be his study, already dressed in an impeccable business suit despite the early hour. He looked more rested than he had during their interview, though Eleanor could still see the weight of worry in his eyes. Behind him shuffled an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her silver hair perfectly styled and her makeup applied with the precision of someone who had once been a society beauty. "Mrs. Rodriguez, welcome," Richard said, extending his hand. "This is my mother, Eleanor Harrison. She manages the household affairs." Eleanor's pale blue eyes studied Elena with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to judging people quickly and definitively. Her handshake was surprisingly firm for someone her age, and her voice carried the crisp authority of old money when she spoke. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I trust Richard has explained the unique challenges of this position," Eleanor said, her tone making it clear that she had not been consulted about the hiring decision. "We've had considerable difficulty finding staff who can maintain appropriate professional boundaries while dealing with my grandson's behavioral issues." Eleanor met the older woman's gaze steadily, recognizing the test being presented. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand that Marcus has been through tremendous loss. Children process grief differently than adults, and sometimes their behavior reflects their pain rather than their character." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly, though whether in surprise or disapproval was unclear. "Marcus is a Harrison, Mrs. Rodriguez. He comes from a family that has overcome adversity through discipline and determination, not by indulging emotional weakness." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Marcus Harrison appeared at the top of the grand staircase, moving with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate the world as if it were a minefield. He was smaller than Elena had expected from Richard's description, thin and pale, with dark hair that fell across his forehead. But his eyes, those striking green eyes that he had inherited from his mother, held an intelligence and wariness that seemed far too mature for his 11 years. Marcus descended the stairs slowly, his gaze fixed on Elena with the intensity of a predator studying potential prey. He was dressed in expensive, casual clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame, and Elena noticed the way he moved with deliberate control, as if every gesture was calculated for maximum effect. "So you're the new maid," Marcus said when he reached the bottom of the stairs, his voice carrying a politeness that didn't quite mask the underlying challenge. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I presume. Father mentioned you yesterday evening." Elena stepped forward, crouching down slightly to bring herself closer to Marcus's eye level. The gesture was subtle but significant, showing respect for him as a person rather than talking down to him as a child. "Hello, Marcus. Yes, I'm Elena Rodriguez. I'm here to help take care of your home." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face for signs of fear, condescension, or false cheerfulness. When he found none of these familiar reactions, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, revealing a flicker of curiosity beneath his carefully constructed mask. "Are you afraid of knives, Mrs. Rodriguez?" Marcus asked, his tone conversational despite the loaded nature of the question. Elena gasped sharply from her wheelchair while Richard tensed visibly, both of them bracing for Elena's inevitable retreat. Elena considered the question seriously, as if Marcus had asked her about her favorite color or the weather. "I'm respectful of knives," she said finally. "They're tools that can be useful or dangerous, depending on how they're handled." "Are you planning to throw knives at me, Marcus?" The directness of her response clearly caught Marcus off guard. He had expected fear, lectures about safety, or threats of consequences. Instead, Elena had treated his question as a legitimate inquiry, deserving an honest answer. "That depends," Marcus replied, his voice slightly less certain than before. "Are you planning to try to change me?" "I'm planning to clean your house," Elena said simply. "As for changing you, that's not really my job. People can only change themselves, and only when they're ready." Eleanor made a disapproving noise from her wheelchair, clearly displeased with Elena's unconventional approach. In her experience, troubled children needed firm boundaries and clear consequences, not philosophical discussions about personal autonomy. Richard, however, found himself intrigued by Elena's methodology. She wasn't trying to assert authority over Marcus or win him over with false friendliness. Instead, she was treating him as an intelligent human being capable of making rational decisions, which was perhaps exactly what his brilliant son needed. "I have some business to attend to this morning," Richard announced, checking his watch. "Mrs. Rodriguez, perhaps you could familiarize yourself with the household routines. Marcus will be having breakfast in the dining room in 30 minutes. As Richard gathered his briefcase and prepared to leave for the office, Elena noticed the way Marcus watched his father's departure. There was longing in the boy's eyes, quickly hidden but unmistakably present. Whatever anger Marcus felt towards his father, underneath it lay a desperate desire for connection that he had learned to suppress. Eleanor wheeled herself closer to Elena once Richard had left, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I feel obligated to warn you about Marcus's patterns of behavior. He begins with small tests, seemingly innocent questions or minor infractions. If you respond with weakness or excessive sympathy, he will escalate until you either quit or require medical attention." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, appreciating the older woman's concern, even if she disagreed with her assessment. "Thank you for the warning, Mrs. Harrison. May I ask what approaches have been tried in the past?" "Discipline," Eleanor replied firmly. "Clear rules, immediate consequences, no tolerance for manipulation or emotional outbursts. The boy needs structure, not coddling." "And how has that approach worked?" Elena asked gently. Edna's expression tightened, her pride clearly stung by the implication that her methods had been unsuccessful. The previous staff members lacked backbone. They allowed Marcus to manipulate them instead of maintaining proper authority. Elena chose not to point out that if 17 different caregivers had failed using the same approach, perhaps the approach itself needed examination. Instead, she simply nodded and excused herself to explore the penthouse and understand the environment she would be working in. The Harrison home was a masterpiece of interior design, but as Elena moved through the rooms, she began to notice troubling details. Every family photograph that included a woman had been removed or turned face down. Children's artwork and school projects were notably absent from common areas. The living spaces felt sterile and impersonal, as if any evidence of family life had been systematically erased. In the kitchen, Eleanor found evidence of the chaos that had become routine. Broken dishes had been hastily swept into corners. Scorch. Marks on the stove suggested cooking disasters, and the refrigerator bore dents that looked suspiciously like they had been made by thrown objects. This wasn't just the mess of normal household activity, it was the aftermath of systematic destruction. As Elena began organizing her cleaning supplies, she heard Marcus enter the dining room for breakfast. She could overhear Eleanor's voice, carrying from the adjacent room, lecturing about proper posture and table manners. Marcus's responses were monosyllabic, polite, but devoid of any warmth or engagement. Straighten your shoulders, Marcus. A Harrison maintains proper bearing at all times. Yes, grandmother. And finish your orange juice. Proper nutrition is essential for academic performance. Yes, grandmother. Your tutor will arrive at 9 o'clock. I expect you to demonstrate the respect and attention that your father is paying for. Elena could hear the resignation in Marcus's voice, the careful compliance of someone who had learned that resistance only brought more lectures and restrictions. She found herself wondering when he had last been allowed to simply be a child, to express preferences or opinions without being corrected or redirected. After breakfast, Marcus disappeared to his room, while Eleanor retired to her sitting room for what she called her correspondence time. Elena used this opportunity to begin her work, starting with the common areas where she could observe the household's natural rhythms without intruding on anyone's privacy. As she worked, Elena noticed small details that spoke to the family's dysfunction. Expensive furniture bore scratches and stains that suggested careless treatment. Books were scattered randomly rather than organized, as if no one cared enough to maintain order. Most tellingly, there were no personal touches anywhere, no evidence of hobbies or interests or individual personalities. Round 10 o'clock, Elena heard raised voices from the direction of Marcus's room. His tutor, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, emerged from the elevator looking flustered and angry. She approached Eleanor's sitting room, and Elena could overhear fragments of heated conversation. Completely unmanageable. No respect for authority. I cannot work under these conditions. The tutor departed within minutes, leaving Elena to wonder what Marcus had done to drive away yet another educational professional. When she passed his room later, she could hear the muffled sounds of destruction coming from within, furniture being moved and objects hitting walls. Eleanor's response was swift and predictable. She wheeled herself to Marcus's door and began speaking in the authoritative tone she used for all disciplinary matters. Marcus Harrison, you will cease this behavior immediately. Your father is paying good money for your education, and you will show proper respect to your instructors. I don't want a tutor. Marcus's voice carried through the door, strained with an emotion Elena couldn't quite identify. I don't want anyone here. What you want is irrelevant, Eleanor replied sharply. You are a child, and children do as they are told. You will apologize to Mrs. Henderson when she returns tomorrow, and you will complete whatever assignments she gives you without complaint. She's not coming back, Marcus said flatly. None of them come back. There was something heartbreaking about the matter-of-fact way he stated this truth, as if he had long since accepted that everyone who entered his life would eventually abandon him. Eleanor continued her lecture about responsibility and respect, but Eleanor noticed that her voice carried less conviction than before. Even she seemed to be running out of energy for battles that never resulted in victory. That afternoon, while Eleanor napped and Marcus remained barricaded in his room, Elena encountered her first real test. As she was dusting the library, a throwing knife whistled past her head and embedded itself in the wooden bookshelf with a solid thunk. The blade quivered slightly from the impact, positioned exactly where her temple had been moments before. Elena turned slowly to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his green eyes watching her carefully for signs of fear or panic. In his hand, he held another knife, balanced perfectly for throwing. This was clearly a practiced routine, the opening, gambit in whatever psychological warfare he had perfected over the past year. Most of the previous caregivers had screamed, run, or immediately called for help. Some had fainted outright. Eleanor's approach had been to confiscate the knives and impose immediate punishment, which only resulted in Marcus finding more creative ways to acquire weapons and exact revenge. Elena, however, did something completely unexpected. She walked calmly to the bookshelf, grasped the knife's handle, and pulled it free with a practiced motion that spoke of familiarity with such implements. She examined the blade with professional interest, testing its weight and balance. "Nice throw," she said conversationally, turning to face Marcus. "Good distance, excellent accuracy. Where did you learn to do that?" Marcus blinked, clearly thrown off balance by her reaction. "You're not scared?" "Should I be?" Elena asked, genuinely curious. "You didn't aim to hurt me. If you had wanted to hit me, you would have." This was a message, not an attack. Marcus's second knife remained poised in his hand, but his confidence had wavered. "What kind of message do you think it was?" Elena considered the question seriously, rotating the knife she held as she thought. "I think you're telling me that you're dangerous, that I should be afraid of you and leave like all the others. You're protecting yourself the only way you know how." "Maybe I am dangerous," Marcus said, though his voice lacked the conviction he was trying to project. "Maybe you should leave." Elena set the knife down on a nearby table with careful precision. "Marcus, I once knew a boy who threw rocks at anyone who tried to get close to him. He wasn't mean or violent by nature. He was just scared that if he let people care about him, they would leave him like his parents had." Marcus's grip on his remaining knife shifted slightly, his interest captured, despite his determination to remain hostile. "What happened to him?" "He grew up," Elena said simply. "He learned that pushing people away didn't protect him from being hurt. It just guaranteed that he would be alone with his pain." "Where is he now?" Marcus asked, his voice smaller than before. Eleanor's expression grew soft with old grief. "He became my husband. And when he died in a construction accident 6 years ago, I realized that all the time we could have had together was worth every moment of fear about losing him." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss and abandonment. Marcus slowly lowered his knife, his carefully constructed mask of indifference slipping to reveal the frightened child underneath. "I'm sorry your husband died," Marcus said quietly, the first genuine emotion Elena had heard in his voice. "Thank you," Elena replied. "I'm sorry your mother died too. Losing a parent when you're young is one of the hardest things anyone can experience." Marcus flinched slightly at the direct mention of his mother, a subject that had become taboo in the Harrison household. "Grandmother says I shouldn't talk about her. She says it makes the sadness worse." "Oh, what do you think?" Elena asked. "Does not talking about her make you feel better or worse?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with a question he had apparently never been allowed to consider. "Worse," he admitted finally. "It feels like I'm forgetting her, like she never existed." Elena nodded understandingly. "Your grandmother means well, but sometimes grown-ups are wrong about how to handle sadness. Some people need to talk about the people they've lost. It helps keep their memory alive." "You think about your husband?" Marcus asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier hostility. "Every day," Elena confirmed. "I tell him about my day sometimes, like he's still listening. It makes me feel closer to him." Marcus set his remaining knife down on the table next to the first one, a gesture of tentative trust that spoke volumes about his willingness to try a different approach. "What was his name?" Carlos, Elena said with a small smile. He was a carpenter, very good with his hands. He could build anything, fix anything. He would have liked you, I think. He always said that smart children just needed someone to understand them. Mother said that too, Marcus whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. She said I was too smart for my own good sometimes, but that it would help me do amazing things when I grew up. It was the first time Marcus had voluntarily mentioned his mother, and Elena could see the pain and longing in his young face. He was starving for connection, for someone who would listen to his memories without judgment or attempts to redirect his emotions. She sounds like a wise woman, Elena said gently. What else did she used to say? Marcus hesitated, glancing toward the door as if worried about being overheard. When he was satisfied that they were alone, he moved closer to Elena, his voice dropping to a whisper. She used to say that feelings weren't good or bad, they just were. Like weather, you couldn't control when it rained, but you could decide whether to dance in it or hide inside. Helena felt tears prick her eyes at the beauty and wisdom of the sentiment. That's a wonderful way to think about emotions. Your mother sounds like she was very understanding. She was, Marcus agreed, his own eyes growing bright with unshed tears. She never got mad when I cried or when I asked too many questions. She said curiosity was a gift, not a problem. She was right, Elena said firmly. Questions are how we learn and grow. There's nothing wrong with wanting to understand the world around you. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed by his display of emotion, but unable to stop the words that came tumbling out. I miss her so much, he whispered. Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like, and it scares me. What if I forget everything about her? Elena's heart ached for this child who had been carrying such a heavy burden alone for so long. Marcus, love doesn't forget. Even when memories fade, the love stays. Your mother's love for you is part of who you are. Nothing can take that away. The sound of Eleanor's wheelchair approaching in the hallway caused Marcus to quickly step back from Elena, his walls immediately reconstructing themselves. By the time his grandmother appeared in the library doorway, he had resumed his mask of polite indifference, though Eleanor could see the effort it cost him. Marcus, what are you doing in here? Eleanor asked, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with obvious suspicion. I was talking to Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus replied carefully, his tone neutral and respectful. Eleanor's gaze fell on the throwing knives lying on the table, and her expression hardened. Marcus Harrison, we have discussed this repeatedly. These weapons are not toys, and they are not to be used to intimidate the staff. I wasn't intimidating anyone, grandmother, Marcus said, though his denial lacked conviction. Eleanor wheeled herself further into the room, her authority filling the space like a storm cloud. Mrs. Rodriguez, I trust you understand the severity of this situation. Marcus's behavior cannot be tolerated or encouraged through excessive sympathy. Elena met the older woman's gaze steadily. Mrs. Harrison, Marcus and I were having a conversation. He shared some of his feelings about missing his mother, which seems healthy and appropriate for a child his age. Dwelling on the past is neither healthy nor appropriate, Eleanor snapped. Marcus needs to learn to control his emotions and focus on his responsibilities, not wallow in grief that serves no productive purpose. Elena could see Marcus physically shrink under his grandmother's disapproval, the brief moment of openness and connection evaporating like morning mist. The boy who had just shared his deepest fears about forgetting his mother was once again the guarded, hostile child who trusted no one. Grandmother, Marcus said quietly, I should go work on my mathematics. I have assignments to complete. Indeed you do, Eleanor agreed. Mrs. Rodriguez has housework to attend to. I trust there will be no more interruptions to the household routine. As Marcus left the library, Elena caught his eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, she saw gratitude mixed with fear, hope warring with resignation. He wanted to trust her, wanted to believe that someone might finally understand him, but he had been disappointed too many times to fully commit to optimism. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon completing her cleaning duties while reflecting on her interaction with Marcus. She had seen glimpses of the intelligent, sensitive child hiding beneath layers of protective anger and calculated hostility. He wasn't cruel or disturbed, as some of the failed caregivers had suggested. He was simply a boy who had learned to weaponize his intelligence because emotional vulnerability had proven too dangerous. That evening, Richard returned from the office looking even more exhausted than usual. Elena was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he appeared, loosening his tie with the weary movements of a man carrying impossible burdens. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How was your first day? I trust Marcus didn't give you too much trouble." Elena considered how to respond honestly without alarming him. Marcus is a remarkable young man. He's clearly very intelligent and deeply thoughtful. I think he's been misunderstood by many of the people trying to help him. Richard's eyebrows rose in surprise. Misunderstood how? He's not acting out because he's bad or defiant, Elena explained carefully. He's protecting himself the only way he knows how. Children who have experienced significant loss often develop survival strategies that look like problem behaviors, but are actually sophisticated coping mechanisms. "The knives?" Richard asked bluntly. "Did he threaten you with the knives?" "He tested me," Elena acknowledged, "but not in a malicious way. He needed to know whether I would react with fear and run away like the others, or whether I might be someone who could handle his pain without being overwhelmed by it." Richard sank into a kitchen chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of defeat. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I appreciate your optimism, but 17 trained professionals have failed to connect with my son. What makes you think your approach will be different?" Elena paused in her dinner preparations, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Harrison, may I ask you something personal?" Richard nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "When your wife died, how did you handle your grief?" The question caught Richard off guard, forcing him to confront emotions he had spent 3 years avoiding. "I threw myself into work. I stayed busy, kept moving, tried not to think about it." "And did that help?" Elena asked gently. "Did staying busy make the pain go away?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, his hands fidgeting with his loosened tie. "No," he admitted finally. "It just postponed it. The grief was still there, waiting for me whenever I stopped moving." "Marcus can't throw himself into work the way you did," Elena observed. "He's a child with limited control over his environment and his daily activities, so he found other ways to postpone his grief. Unfortunately, his methods involve driving away anyone who might help him process his emotions." The insight hit Richard like a physical blow, forcing him to see his son's behavior in an entirely new light. All this time, he had viewed Marcus's hostility as defiance or manipulation. The possibility that it was actually a misguided attempt at emotional survival had never occurred to him. "So what do we do?" Richard asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion and hope in equal measure. "How do we help him?" "We start by letting him talk about his mother," Elena said simply. "We acknowledge his loss instead of pretending it didn't happen. We show him that remembering her with love is healthy, not something to be ashamed of or hidden away." Richard flinched at the suggestion, his own pain about Victoria's death still too raw to examine directly. "My mother believes that dwelling on the past prevents healing. She thinks focusing on Victoria's death keeps Marcus stuck in his grief." "With respect to Mrs. Harrison," Elena said carefully, "I think Marcus is stuck because he's not allowed to grieve properly. When children can't express their emotions safely, those feelings don't disappear. They just find other ways to come out, usually in ways that look like behavioral problems." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Marcus entering the kitchen, drawn by the smell of Elena's cooking. He moved cautiously, clearly uncertain about whether he would be welcome after the afternoon's events with his grandmother. "Something smells good," Marcus said quietly, addressing Elena rather than his father. "What are you making?" "Arroz con pollo," Elena replied with a warm smile. "It was my husband's favorite dish. I thought you might like to try something different." Richard watched the interaction between his son and their new housekeeper with fascination. Marcus's posture was still guarded, but there was a softness around his eyes that Richard hadn't seen in years. For the first time since Victoria's death, his son seemed genuinely interested in connecting with another human being. "Is it spicy?" Marcus asked, moving closer to examine the simmering pot. "A little," Eleanor admitted, "but not too much. Your mother was a doctor, yes? She probably knew that children need to try new foods to develop their palates." Marcus's face lit up at the mention of his mother in such a natural, positive context. "She was always trying to get me to eat different things. She said variety was important for proper nutrition and brain development." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched his son smile genuinely for the first time in months. Elena had accomplished in one day what teams of professionals had failed to achieve in 3 years. She had given Marcus permission to remember his mother with joy instead of only pain. As they sat down to dinner together, Richard noticed that Marcus seemed more present and engaged than he had been in years. He asked Elena questions about her cooking, listened attentively to her stories about learning recipes from her own mother, and even shared a few memories of dishes Victoria used to make. Eleanor joined them for dinner, but remained largely silent, clearly disapproving of the emotional openness that Elena was encouraging. She ate her food with mechanical precision, her expression growing more pinched with each fond memory Marcus shared about his mother. After dinner, as Elena cleaned the kitchen and Richard helped Marcus with homework, Eleanor cornered Elena in the pantry. Her voice was low but intense, carrying the weight of years of accumulated frustration and fear. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I feel obligated to warn you about the path you're taking with Marcus. Encouraging him to dwell on his mother's death will not help him heal. It will only reopen wounds that have finally begun to close." Elena paused in her dishwashing, choosing her words carefully. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand your concern. But in my experience, wounds that are forced closed before they're properly cleaned tend to become infected. Marcus is not some charity case for you to fix with folk wisdom and emotional indulgence," Eleanor snapped, her careful composure finally cracking. "He is a Harrison, heir to a family legacy that demands strength and discipline. Your sentimental approach will only make him weak." Elena turned to face the older woman, her expression compassionate but firm. "Mrs. Harrison, strength doesn't come from hiding from pain. It comes from learning to carry it with grace. Marcus needs to know that his feelings are valid and that he's safe to express them." "Safe?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "The world is not safe, Mrs. Rodriguez. Life is brutal and unforgiving, and children who are taught to indulge their emotions are unprepared for the reality they will face as adults." Elena could see the deep pain beneath Eleanor's harsh words, recognizing the voice of someone who had never been allowed to grieve properly herself. "Mrs. Harrison, may I ask what happened to make you believe that emotions are dangerous?" Eleanor's composure shattered completely, tears streaming down her carefully made-up cheeks. "I lost a son too," she whispered, her voice breaking with decades of suppressed grief. "Richard's twin brother Daniel. He died of pneumonia when he was 7 years old, and I watched my husband drink himself to death because he couldn't handle the loss." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with old pain and regret. Eleanor could see that Eleanor's rigid approach to Marcus's grief came from her own traumatic experience with loss and its aftermath. "I'm so sorry," Elena said gently. "Losing a child is the worst pain imaginable. But Mrs. Harrison, your husband's response to grief doesn't mean that all emotional expression is dangerous. Some people need to talk through their pain to heal." "Talking didn't save my marriage or my family," Eleanor replied bitterly. "Discipline and moving forward are what allowed me to survive." "But did you ever really heal?" Elena asked quietly. "Or did you just learn to carry the pain in silence?" Eleanor's silence was answer enough. As the older woman wheeled herself away from the kitchen, Eleanor understood that the Harrison family's dysfunction ran much deeper than Marcus's behavioral problems. 3 generations of unprocessed grief had created a legacy of emotional isolation that would take time and patience to address. That night, as Elena prepared to leave for her own small apartment, Marcus appeared in the foyer. He had changed into pajamas and his hair was damp from his bath, making him look younger and more vulnerable than usual. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said hesitantly, "thank you for listening to me today. About my mother, I mean." "Thank you for sharing your memories with me," Elena replied. "Your mother sounds like she was a wonderful person." Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Will you come back tomorrow?" The question was asked with such tentative hope that Elena's heart ached for this child who had learned to expect abandonment from every adult in his life. "I'll be here," Elena promised. "And Marcus, it's okay to miss her. It's okay to be sad. Those feelings don't make you weak. They make you human." As Elena left the Harrison penthouse that evening, she carried with her the weight of a family's accumulated grief and the fragile hope that maybe, with time and patience, she could help them learn to heal together. Marcus's journey toward emotional recovery would be long and difficult, but for the first time in 3 years, someone was walking beside him instead of trying to force him down a path he wasn't ready to travel. The seeds of change had been planted, but Elena knew that the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for connection, and the ongoing task of helping a brilliant wounded child learn that love didn't have to be a source of fear. 3 weeks had passed since Elena Rodriguez first walked through the doors of the Harrison penthouse, and the atmosphere in the home had begun to shift in ways both subtle and profound. The morning, screaming matches that had once echoed through the marble halls had given way to something approaching normalcy, though Eleanor Harrison remained skeptical of the changes she witnessed. Elena arrived each morning to find Marcus already awake, often sitting by the large windows in the dining room, watching the city come alive below. Unlike the sullen, hostile child who had once barricaded himself in his bedroom until noon, Marcus now seemed genuinely curious about the world beyond his gilded prison. Elena had learned to bring a thermos of hot chocolate, and they would spend the first few minutes of each day sharing quiet conversation while she prepared breakfast. On this particular Wednesday morning, Elena noticed something different about Marcus's demeanor. He sat hunched over what appeared to be a letter, his young face creased with concentration, and something that looked suspiciously like excitement. When he heard her approach, he quickly folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, but not before Eleanor caught a glimpse of elegant handwriting and official letterhead. "Good morning, Marcus," Elena said warmly, setting down her bag and noting the way his eyes followed her movements with unusual intensity. "You're up early today, even for you." Marcus fidgeted with the paper in his pocket, clearly wrestling with whether to share whatever news he had received. "Mrs. Rodriguez, can I ask you something about secrets?" Elena paused in her preparations, recognizing the weight behind his question. Over the past weeks, she had learned that Marcus's seemingly casual inquiries often masked deeper emotional struggles. "What kind of secrets are you thinking about?" "The kind that might make someone happy, but might also make someone else very angry," Marcus said carefully, his green eyes searching Elena's face for guidance. "The kind where you're not sure if keeping it is protecting people or lying to them." Elena settled into the chair across from him, giving Marcus her full attention. She had learned that these moments of uncertainty were when he was most open to genuine connection and guidance. "That sounds like a complicated situation. Can you tell me more about it?" Marcus pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolding it with hands that trembled slightly from nervousness. "This came yesterday, but I haven't shown it to father or grandmother yet. I'm supposed to show them all my mail, but this feels different somehow." Elena could see the letterhead, now clearly marked with the logo of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Marcus's name was written in flowing script across the front, and the formal nature of the correspondence suggested something significant. "Would you like me to read it with you?" Marcus nodded eagerly, sliding the letter across the table. Elena unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the contents with growing amazement. The letter was an invitation for Marcus to participate in a special young scholars program at the museum, a highly selective initiative designed for gifted children with exceptional interests in art and history. Marcus, this is incredible, Elena breathed, looking up at his anxious face. Do you understand what this means? They want you to be part of their advanced program for young artists and historians. I know, Marcus whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and terror. But I applied for it months ago, back when Mother was still alive. I used her information as my emergency contact, and I never thought they would actually accept me. Elena felt a pang of understanding as the full situation became clear. Marcus had applied for this program during happier times, probably with his mother's encouragement and support. Now, 3 years later, the acceptance had arrived like a message from another life, offering opportunities that felt both wonderful and impossible. What does the program involve? Elena asked, studying the details outlined in the letter. It says here that participants spend 2 afternoons a week working with museum curators and visiting artists. They get to handle actual artifacts and learn restoration techniques. Marcus's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm, the first time Elena had seen him express unguarded joy about anything. Mother used to take me to the museum all the time. She said I had an artist's eye, that I could see things in paintings that other people missed. She always said that art was like a language that spoke directly to the soul. The mention of his mother in such positive, specific terms marked a significant breakthrough. For weeks, Elena had been gently encouraging Marcus to share memories of Victoria, but he had been cautious about revealing too much, especially when Eleanor might overhear. This spontaneous sharing suggested a growing trust and comfort with emotional expression. Your mother sounds like she really understood and supported your interests, Elena observed. What kind of art did you enjoy looking at together? Marcus's face softened with memory, his defensive walls lowering as he recalled happier times. She loved the Impressionist paintings, especially the ones with lots of light and color. But I was always drawn to the older pieces, the ones with stories hidden in the details. She would let me pick a different painting each visit, and we would sit in front of it for as long as I wanted, making up stories about the people in the pictures. Elena could envision the scene clearly, a brilliant child and his devoted mother sharing quiet moments of discovery and imagination in the museum's hushed galleries. It was exactly the kind of enriching experience that Marcus had been denied since Victoria's death, the sort of intellectual and emotional stimulation that his developing mind desperately needed. So why are you worried about showing this letter to your father and grandmother? Elena asked gently. This seems like something they would be proud of. Marcus's expression grew troubled, his fingers nervously folding and unfolding the edge of the letter. Grandmother doesn't think art is practical. She says it's a waste of time for someone who will inherit a business empire. And father, he's so busy with work that I don't think he even remembers that I like art. Elena could see the deeper fear beneath Marcus's practical concerns. He was afraid that his family would dismiss something that connected him to his mother's memory, something that represented his authentic interests rather than the expectations others had placed upon him. The museum program wasn't just an academic opportunity. It was a link to the person he had been before grief and trauma had forced him to become someone else. Marcus, can I tell you what I think? Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. I think your mother would want you to pursue this opportunity. I think she would be incredibly proud that you were accepted into such a prestigious program. But what if they say no? Marcus whispered, voicing his deepest fear. What if they think it's too dangerous, or too impractical, or too much trouble? I can't handle another disappointment. Elena reached across the table and gently covered Marcus's hand with her own, a gesture of comfort that he no longer flinched away from. Then we'll figure out another way to honor your interests and talents. But I think you might be surprised by their reaction. Sometimes people need to be reminded of who you really are beneath all the anger and acting out. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of Eleanor's wheelchair approaching caused him to quickly fold the letter and slide it back into his pocket. Elena noticed how automatically he shifted back into his mask of polite indifference, the transformation so swift and complete that it broke her heart. Good morning, grandmother. Marcus said with careful neutrality as Eleanor entered the dining room. Mrs. Rodriguez was just preparing breakfast. Eleanor's sharp eyes moved between Marcus and Elena, clearly sensing that she had interrupted something significant. Marcus, you seem unusually animated this morning. I trust you're not neglecting your regular studies for frivolous pursuits. No, grandmother, Marcus replied dutifully. I completed all my assignments yesterday evening. Excellent. Your new tutor, Mr. Davidson, will arrive at 10 o'clock. I expect you to demonstrate the respect and attention that his credentials deserve. Unlike some of his predecessors, Mr. Davidson has extensive experience with challenging students. Elena noticed the way Marcus's shoulders tensed at the mention of yet another new tutor. In the 3 weeks since she had started working for the family, 2 more educational professionals had come and gone, each lasting slightly longer than their predecessors, but ultimately unable to connect with Marcus's unique learning style and emotional needs. Mrs. Rodriguez, Eleanor continued, turning her attention to Elena with the imperious tone she used for all household staff. I trust you will ensure that Marcus is properly prepared for his tutorial session. No distractions or interruptions will be tolerated. Oh, of course, Mrs. Harrison, Elena replied respectfully, though she couldn't help but notice the way Marcus seemed to shrink under his grandmother's rigid expectations. After Eleanor had departed for her morning routine, Marcus remained quiet and withdrawn, the earlier excitement about the museum letter completely suppressed. Elena continued preparing breakfast while observing Marcus's internal struggle. She could see him wrestling with whether to trust her with his secret, whether to risk sharing something precious and vulnerable that might be rejected or dismissed. These moments of decision were crucial in their developing relationship, opportunities for him to practice emotional courage in a safe environment. Marcus, Elena said softly, whatever you decide about that letter, I want you to know that your interests and passions matter. They're part of who you are, and who you are is worth celebrating. Marcus looked up at her with such profound gratitude that Elena had to turn away to hide her own emotional response. This child had been starved for validation and acceptance for so long that even basic affirmation seemed revolutionary to him. When Richard appeared for breakfast 30 minutes later, Elena could see the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the stress that was consuming him. His business empire was facing unprecedented challenges, with regulatory investigations and hostile takeover attempts requiring his constant attention. "Good morning," Richard said distractedly, accepting the coffee Elena offered while scanning his phone for urgent messages. "Marcus, I hope you're prepared for your session with Mr. Davidson. Your grandmother speaks very highly of his qualifications." Marcus nodded silently, pushing his food around his plate without much appetite. Elena could see him struggling with whether to share the museum letter with his father, the weight of the secret making normal conversation difficult. "Father," Marcus said suddenly, his voice carrying a determination that surprised both adults. "There's something I need to show you." Richard looked up from his phone, his attention fully focused on his son for the first time in days. Marcus pulled the letter from his pocket with hands that shook slightly from nervousness, placing it carefully on the table between them. "I received this yesterday," Marcus said quietly. "I applied for it a long time ago before—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would have mentioned his mother's death. Richard picked up the letter, his eyebrows rising as he read the contents. Elena watched his expression shift from confusion to amazement, to something that might have been pride, though it was difficult to tell beneath his exhaustion. "Marcus, this is extraordinary," Richard said slowly, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "The Metropolitan Museum's Young Scholars Program. Do you have any idea how selective this is? Only 20 children in the entire city are accepted each year." Marcus's face lit up with cautious hope, encouraged by his father's positive reaction. "So you think I should do it?" "Of course you should do it," Richard replied, though Eleanor noticed a flicker of uncertainty cross his features. although I'm not sure when you would fit it into your schedule. Between tutoring and your other studies, you're already quite busy." Elena could see Marcus's excitement beginning to dim as practical obstacles were introduced. This was the pattern that had dominated his life since his mother's death. Any interest or passion that deviated from the prescribed routine was met with logistical concerns rather than enthusiasm. "Actually," Elena interjected carefully, "the program is designed to supplement traditional education, not replace it. Many of the participants are homeschooled children who benefit from the social interaction and specialized instruction." Richard looked at Elena with surprise, as if he had forgotten she was present during this family discussion. "You're familiar with the program?" "I researched it while Marcus was getting ready this morning," Elena replied, which was only a small stretching of the truth. "It has an excellent reputation for developing critical thinking skills and cultural awareness, the kind of foundation that would serve Marcus well, regardless of his future career path." Eleanor's voice carried from the doorway before Richard could respond, sharp with disapproval as she took in the scene. "What program are we discussing? Marcus, I trust you're not allowing yourself to be distracted from your core academic responsibilities." Richard held up the letter, his expression carefully neutral. "Mother, Marcus has been accepted into the Metropolitan Museum's Young Scholars program. It's quite an honor." Eleanor wheeled herself closer, her face hardening as she grasped the implications. "Art classes. Richard, surely you're not seriously considering allowing Marcus to waste time on such frivolous pursuits. He has responsibilities, expectations to meet. The Harrison legacy doesn't include dilettante artistic pretensions." Marcus seemed to physically recoil from his grandmother's harsh words, the brief moment of hope extinguished by her automatic dismissal of his interests. Elena could see him beginning to retreat back into his defensive shell, the vulnerable child who had shared his dreams disappearing behind familiar walls of anger and indifference. "It's not frivolous, grandmother," Marcus said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Mother used to say that understanding art helped develop critical thinking and cultural awareness." The mention of Victoria caused Eleanor's expression to harden further, her long-held belief that discussing the dead only prolonged suffering evident in every line of her face. "Your mother said many things, Marcus. Not all of them were practical or wise." Elena watched Richard struggle with the competing pressures of his mother's expectations and his son's obvious passion. She could see him weighing the political implications of supporting Marcus against Eleanor's wishes, calculating the potential consequences of family conflict against his child's emotional well-being. "Perhaps," Richard said carefully, "we could discuss this further when we have more time to consider all the implications. Marcus, you should focus on preparing for your tutorial session with Mr. Davidson." Marcus's face fell, recognizing the diplomatic language that adults used when they wanted to avoid making difficult decisions. He had learned to interpret such responses as polite rejections, ways of postponing conversations that would ultimately result in disappointment. "Yes, Father," Marcus replied with the flat compliance that had become his default response to adult authority. "I'll put the letter away and focus on my regular studies." Elena felt her heart break as she watched Marcus carefully fold the museum letter and slide it back into his pocket, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the obvious pain he was experiencing. This was exactly the kind of moment that had taught him to stop sharing his authentic self with the adults in his life. As the family dispersed to their various morning activities, Elena found herself alone in the kitchen, struggling with her own growing frustration. She understood that Richard and Eleanor were trying to protect Marcus in their own ways, but their inability to see past their own fears and expectations was slowly crushing the intelligent, creative child who desperately needed their support. When Mr. Davidson arrived at 10 o'clock, Elena observed the interaction from a distance while completing her household tasks. The new tutor was a stern-looking man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority in his classroom. He carried himself with the confidence of extensive experience, though Eleanor noticed that his approach to Marcus seemed to rely heavily on traditional disciplinary methods. "Young man, I understand you've had difficulty maintaining appropriate relationships with previous instructors," Mr. Davidson announced as he settled into the library where tutoring sessions were conducted. "I want you to understand from the beginning that I will not tolerate disrespect, disruption, or any form of acting out behavior." Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, his green eyes fixed on the tutor with an intensity that Eleanor had learned to recognize as a warning sign. When Marcus became completely still and focused like this, it usually meant he was calculating his response to a perceived threat or challenge. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied with exaggerated politeness, his tone so perfectly respectful that only someone who knew him well would detect the underlying hostility. "I understand completely." Elena could see the dynamic that was already developing between student and teacher. Mr. Davidson interpreted Marcus's compliance as evidence of successful authority establishment, while Marcus was simply gathering information about his newest adversary's weaknesses and pressure points. The tutorial session proceeded smoothly for the first hour, with Marcus demonstrating the brilliant intellect that had always impressed his educators. He absorbed information quickly, asked thoughtful questions, and completed assignments with efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. To an outside observer, the session would have appeared successful. Elena, however, noticed subtle signs of Marcus's growing agitation. His posture became increasingly rigid, his responses more clipped and formal, his movements carefully controlled in the way that preceded his most dramatic outbursts. Mr. Davidson, unfortunately, seemed oblivious to these warning signals, interpreting Marcus's behavior as evidence of proper discipline rather than mounting pressure. The explosion came during the second hour, triggered by what appeared to be a relatively minor incident. Mr. Davidson had criticized Marcus's handwriting, comparing it unfavorably to students he had taught in more traditional academic settings. The critique was delivered in a tone of condescending correction that seemed designed to establish dominance rather than encourage improvement. "Young man, penmanship is a reflection of character," Mr. Davidson announced, examining Marcus's carefully completed mathematics assignment. "Sloppy writing suggests sloppy thinking, and sloppy thinking is unacceptable in someone of your supposed intelligence." Elena, who was dusting the hallway outside the library, saw Marcus's entire body tense at the insult. The word "supposed" had been delivered with particular emphasis, clearly intended to challenge Marcus's sense of intellectual superiority. For a child whose intelligence was one of the few sources of pride he had left, such a direct attack was guaranteed to provoke a response. "My thinking isn't sloppy," Marcus replied, his voice deadly calm in the way that Elena had learned to fear. "And my intelligence isn't supposed. It's been tested extensively by professionals who are far more qualified than you to make such assessments." Mr. Davidson's face flushed with anger at what he interpreted as direct insubordination. "Young man, you will not speak to me in that tone. You will apologize immediately and rewrite this assignment with proper attention to penmanship standards." "No," Marcus said simply, standing up from his chair with fluid grace. "I won't." What happened next unfolded with the theatrical precision that Marcus had perfected over months of driving away unwanted authority figures. He walked calmly to the library's antique desk, opened the bottom drawer that contained his father's collection of throwing knives, and selected one with the casual expertise of someone completely comfortable with such weapons. Mr. Davidson's confident demeanor evaporated as Marcus balanced the knife in his hand, testing its weight with professional competence. "Put that down immediately," the tutor commanded, though his voice had lost much of its earlier authority. "You criticized my precision," Marcus said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Perhaps you'd like a demonstration of exactly how precise I can be." The knife flew from Marcus's hand with deadly accuracy, embedding itself in the wooden bookshelf exactly 2 inches from Mr. Davidson's left ear. The blade quivered from the impact, its polished surface catching the morning light streaming through the library windows. Mr. Davidson's face went white as he stared at the knife, his hands trembling as he realized how close the blade had come to his head. Like all of Marcus's previous tutors, he had no way of knowing that the boy's aim was intentionally precise, that the near miss was calculated for maximum psychological impact rather than actual danger. "You're insane," Mr. Davidson whispered, backing toward the library door. "This child is dangerous. He needs professional help, not education." Marcus selected a second knife from the drawer, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "Actually, Mr. Davidson, I need educators who understand that intelligence comes in many forms, and that respecting students produces better results than insulting them." Elena, who had been listening to the escalating confrontation from the hallway, decided it was time to intervene. She entered the library calmly, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to diffusing volatile situations. "Marcus," she said quietly, "perhaps Mr. Davidson would benefit from seeing some of your artwork instead of your knife skills. Didn't you mention that you've been working on some sketches?" The unexpected intervention caught both Marcus and Mr. Davidson off guard. Elena's tone was neither alarmed nor confrontational, simply matter-of-fact, as if walking into a room where someone was brandishing weapons was perfectly normal. Marcus paused, the second knife still balanced in his hand, clearly uncertain how to respond to Elena's calm suggestion. He had expected screaming, running, or demands for immediate punishment. Instead, she was offering him an alternative way to demonstrate his abilities. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Mr. Davidson said shakily, "this child just threw a knife at my head. He needs to be restrained and removed immediately." "Actually," Eleanor replied thoughtfully, "he threw a knife near your head. If Marcus had wanted to hurt you, Mr. Davidson, you would already be injured. His aim is quite exceptional." The casual acknowledgement of Marcus's skill, rather than condemnation of his behavior, created a moment of cognitive dissonance that broke the cycle of escalation. Marcus slowly lowered the second knife, his expression shifting from cold rage to confused curiosity. "You're not afraid," Marcus observed, studying Elena's face for signs of the terror that usually followed his demonstrations. "Should I be?" Elena asked genuinely. "You haven't given me any reason to fear you, Marcus. You're angry and frustrated, which is understandable given the circumstances, but you're not actually dangerous to people who treat you with respect." Mr. Davidson looked between Elena and Marcus as if they were both completely insane, his conventional understanding of appropriate adult-child relationships completely overwhelmed by the unconventional dynamic he was witnessing. "This is madness," he declared, gathering his materials with shaking hands. "I cannot work under these conditions. The boy needs psychiatric intervention, not academic instruction." As Mr. Davidson fled the library, Elena noticed that Marcus seemed deflated rather than triumphant. The brief moment of connection with her had reminded him of what normal human interaction could feel like, making his return to isolation even more painful. "I ruined it again, didn't I?" Marcus said quietly, setting the second knife down on the desk with careful precision. "Another tutor gone, another failure to add to my collection." Elena moved closer, her expression gentle but serious. "Marcus, can I ask you something? When you throw those knives, what are you really trying to achieve?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how to articulate feelings he had never been encouraged to examine. "I want them to see me," he said finally. "Not the broken kid they're supposed to fix, not the problem they're being paid to solve. Just me, the real me." "And what happens when they see the real you?" Elena asked softly. "They leave," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "They always leave." Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized the devastating logic of Marcus's behavior. He had learned to drive people away quickly, rather than risk becoming attached to someone who would eventually abandon him anyway. It was a survival strategy, born of profound hurt and fear of further loss. "Marcus," Elena said gently, "what if I told you that there are people who won't leave? even when they see all of you, including the angry and frightened parts. Marcus looked at her with such desperate hope that Elena had to steady herself against the weight of his need. How could you know that? How could anyone promise something like that? Because, Elena said simply, some people understand that caring about someone means staying through the difficult times, not just the easy ones. Your mother was like that, wasn't she? Marcus nodded, tears finally spilling over as he allowed himself to remember what unconditional love had felt like. She never left, no matter how bad my tantrums were or how many questions I asked or how much I cried when I was scared. That's because she loved the whole you, Elena explained. Not just the parts that were easy or convenient or well-behaved. Real love doesn't require perfection, Marcus. It just requires honesty. As Marcus began to sob with the release of months of suppressed grief and longing, Eleanor opened her arms and let him collapse against her, offering the kind of comfort he had been denied for far too long. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of his latest educational failure, Marcus began to understand that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to earn love through perfect behavior or drive it away through deliberate destruction. The healing process would be long and difficult, with many setbacks and challenges ahead. But for the first time since his mother's death, Marcus allowed himself to hope that he might not have to face his pain alone. 6 months later, the Harrison penthouse buzzed with unfamiliar energy. Sunlight streamed through windows that no longer felt like barriers, illuminating walls adorned with Marcus's artwork alongside family photographs that had finally emerged from storage. The sterile museum atmosphere had transformed into something warmer, more lived in, more human. Marcus stood before his easel in what had once been a formal sitting room, now converted into his art studio. Paint covered his fingers and streaked his old clothes as he worked on a canvas depicting the city skyline at sunset. Elena watched from the doorway, amazed by the transformation in the boy who had once terrorized anyone who dared enter his world. "The perspective on the buildings is incredible," Elena observed, stepping closer to examine his work. "Your technique has really improved since starting the museum program." Marcus beamed with pride, his green eyes bright with the enthusiasm that had replaced his former coldness. "Professor Chen says I have natural spatial intelligence. She thinks I might want to study architecture like father, but with an artistic approach." The mention of Richard brought a smile to Elena's face. Over the months, she had watched father and son slowly rebuild their relationship, learning to communicate through shared interests rather than avoiding difficult conversations. Richard had even started joining Marcus for weekend museum visits, discovering his own appreciation for art in the process. Eleanor's voice carried from the dining room, though her tone had softened considerably from the harsh authority she once wielded. "Marcus, your lunch is ready, and please wash your hands properly before eating." "Coming, grandmother," Marcus called back, but without the resigned compliance that had once characterized his responses. The relationship between grandmother and grandson had evolved into something resembling mutual respect, built on Eleanor's grudging admiration for Marcus's artistic talents and his growing emotional maturity. As Marcus cleaned his brushes, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The breakthrough had come gradually, through countless small moments of connection and understanding. There had been setbacks, of course, days when Marcus reverted to his old patterns of anger and withdrawal, when the grief over his mother's loss overwhelmed his progress toward healing. But Elena had remained constant, offering the steady presence that Marcus needed to believe in the possibility of lasting relationships. She had learned to see past his defensive behaviors to the brilliant, sensitive child underneath, and more importantly, she had taught others to see him the same way. The turning point had come when Richard finally took a leave of absence from his business empire to focus on his son. The decision had been prompted by Marcus's acceptance into an advanced art program that required parental involvement, forcing Richard to confront his own avoidance of emotional intimacy. "Elena," Marcus said quietly as he dried his hands, "do you think Mother would be proud of my paintings?" It was a question he asked often, this need for validation from the woman who had shaped his earliest understanding of love and creativity. Elena always answered with the same gentle honesty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "I think she would be amazed by your talent and even more proud of your courage," Elena replied. "It takes real bravery to share your art with the world, to be vulnerable enough to let people see what matters to you." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then surprised Elena by wrapping his arms around her in a spontaneous hug. Physical affection had been rare in the early months of their relationship, another casualty of his fear of abandonment and loss. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered against her shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." Elena felt tears threaten as she returned his embrace, remembering the angry, frightened child who had once thrown knives to keep the world at bay. That Marcus still existed would always be part of who he was, but now he coexisted with this version who could express gratitude and accept love without fear. "Marcus," she said gently, "you saved yourself. I just stayed long enough to watch you do it." As they walked together toward the dining room, Elena caught sight of Richard through his office window. He was on the phone, but instead of the tense, exhausted expression that had once defined him, he looked calm and focused. He had learned to delegate more responsibilities at work, to prioritize his role as a father over his identity as a business mogul. The family gathered around the lunch table, a ritual that had become sacred in their rebuilt life together. Eleanor presided from her wheelchair, but her authority had evolved from rigid control to gentle guidance. Richard shared stories from his shortened workday, while Marcus described his latest projects at the museum program. Elena served the meal she had prepared, listening to the easy conversation that flowed between family members who had learned to see each other as individuals rather than sources of disappointment or obligation. The throwing knives remained in Richard's collection, but they had become museum pieces rather than weapons, symbols of a darker time that had ultimately led to healing. After lunch, as Eleanor retired for her afternoon rest and Richard returned to his abbreviated work schedule, Marcus asked Elena to join him in his studio. He led her to a covered easel in the corner, his expression suddenly shy and uncertain. "I've been working on something special," he said, carefully removing the cloth to reveal a portrait that took Eleanor's breath away. It depicted the three most important women in his life. His mother, Victoria, painted from memory with ethereal light surrounding her figure. Elena herself, captured with the warm smile that had become Marcus's anchor. And surprisingly, Eleanor, rendered with the dignity and strength that Marcus had finally learned to appreciate. "It's called The Women Who Saved Me," Marcus explained quietly. "Mother saved me by teaching me how to love. You saved me by teaching me it was safe to be loved. And grandmother saved me by teaching me that love sometimes looks like protection, even when it feels like walls." Elena studied the painting with growing amazement, seeing not just technical skill, but emotional wisdom that seemed far beyond Marcus's years. He'd learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that loss was painful but survivable, that anger was a valid emotion but not a permanent identity, that family could be both the source of wounds and the path to healing. "Marcus, this is extraordinary," Elena said finally, "not just as art but as understanding. You've learned something that many adults never figure out." "What's that?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "That broken things can be beautiful when they're put back together with love." Udestadon, as the afternoon sun slanted through the studio windows, Elena marveled at the transformation that had occurred in this space and in this family. The boy, who had once used weapons to push people away, now used art to draw them closer. The father, who had hidden behind work, now made time for relationship. The grandmother, who had enforced silence, now encouraged expression. Marcus returned to his easel, adding final touches to his sunset cityscape while humming a melody his mother had once sung to him. Eleanor watched him work, No longer the angry child throwing knives in desperate attempts to be seen, but a young artist confidently sharing his vision with the world. The throwing knives had stopped flying the day Marcus realized he was already visible to those who mattered. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are put down not through force, but through the simple recognition that they are no longer needed. Elena smiled as she tidied the studio, thinking about the family she had helped rebuild and the boy who had taught her that healing was always possible, even in the most seemingly hopeless situations. Love had expanded to fill the spaces that grief had carved out, proving that broken hearts could indeed hold more than whole ones ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.